that people will be genuinely involved. And, Mr Chair, I'll take a number of other calls to highlight the Green Party's opposition to many other sections of the clauses in this bill.
I call Grant Robertson.
Very much, Mr Chair. The first of several calls I intend to take. And I want to start with two process points which I think are important and highly relevant to Part 1 of the bill. The first of those is the process of the bill itself, and I'll give the Minister one piece of credit. He has a unique ability to bring New Zealanders together, because he has brought together Federated Farmers, Fonterra, infrastructure operators, airports, Fish and Game, the Environmental Defence Society, Forest and Bird, unlikely allies, it would be fair to say, in opposition to this piece of legislation. So I'll give him that. But the process that this bill has gone through to come back to this House is less than optimal. And we've got to take ourselves back, Mr Chair, to the 3rd of December 2015. Because that's when the bill went off to the Select Committee to begin its consideration. And the process concern I've got, Mr Chair, is that hundreds, if not thousands of New Zealanders have engaged with this piece of legislation. They've gone to and given submissions in person, 137 submissions in person. Those hearings were finished on the 2nd of June 2016. There was a departmental report, which I'm going to return to in a moment, Mr Chair, that was produced towards the end of 2016, and then things ground to a halt. And they ground to a halt because the national government, the cabinet ministers, didn't know what to do. They couldn't get the legislation through. And the Select Committee was trying to do its job, and it was unable to do that. And we ended up with a bill coming back without amendment. That then went away again. And now we've got a situation where the bill and the numerous SOPs that are in front of us today actually haven't had proper public scrutiny. Because the opportunity to actually go through quite different proposals has been denied, because the government, having mucked around, faffed about, have now come back to us with this bill, and we don't have. It's substantially different, and submitters have not had the opportunity to have proper input into this. Now, the Minister may well say these ideas have been out there for some time. This process has been so shambolic, so confused, so contradictory, that no member of the public, even those most engaged in it, would be able to put hand on heart and say they know what is happening with this piece of legislation. And that is the major process flaw that we now encounter in trying to debate the bill. The Minister said when he stood up that the ideal behind this bill was to simplify the legislation and make it more efficient. There is absolutely no doubt that what this legislation does is make the RMA less effective and more complicated and potentially more expensive for those people who engage with it. It is a complete failure in the goal that it set itself, let alone the Minister's somewhat odd claim when he stood up that this was the answer to the housing crisis, and I'm sure my colleague Phil Twyford will have something to say about that. The second process point I want to make, Mr Chair, is actually about Part 1. Part 1 of the bill contains 161 clauses. This is the departmental report that covers Part 1 of the bill. I didn't sit on the Select Committee. I'm trying to do my job as a Member of Parliament in scrutinising the bill that has been returned to us today. And it is so poorly laid out now that within Part 1, rather than grouping together issues that have some connection to one another, the Minister's come in as some kind of Time Lord and said, right, we're going to have the things that come into force right away, they're one subpart, then we're going to have the things that come into force in 6 months, then we're going to have the things that come into force in a year. It's utterly incoherent, Mr Chair. And I know that there are committees of Parliament considering the way that we debate bills, and in that regard, Mr Chair, I will just refer members to the departmental report, because the departmental report does what the Minister couldn't do. It actually structures how the bill works, and so it covers off national direction, plan making, consenting, courts, process changes and minor and technical amendments. That would have been the way to do it. That's what would have given us the ability to coherently work our way through this bill. But instead we have the hodgepodge of amendments and changes that the Minister has decided that he could come up with. Mr Chair, just finishing in this call on those process-related elements, and I do want to take another call on more substantive elements. We have an executive-dominated process that has led to an incoherent, Mr Chair.
I call Grant Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Chair. That has led to an incoherent piece of legislation in front of us today, and the Minister has only himself to blame for that. I do then want to come to some substantive matters in part one, and as I say, I wish we were debating this in a way where we were following on from each other, but it's very hard to know what calls we'll get, and so therefore we just have to put up with it, but I do think we could do significantly better. The biggest concern I've got as somebody who has interacted with the RMA in multiple different ways, as a person who helped draft some of the numerous amendments that occurred in the early 2000s and then has been on both sides of it working with constituents, is that a couple of the core elements of the RMA are being compromised here. And one of those core elements was around the proximity of decision making. Who are the people best placed to make decisions? And the RMA did something really important when it put together the bits of the Town and Country Planning Act and the bits of the National Development Act, which was that it located that decision making as close to the place that it was relevant as possible. And what we've got here, Mr Chair, in part one, is the unpicking of that. And this is what has led Geoffrey Palmer, one of the authors of the RMA, to say due process is replaced by executive fiat, because that's essentially what's happening here. So the two elements that were core were get decision-making in the right place and have a process that was clear and understood by everybody in it. And that's where this bill goes horribly, horribly wrong, Mr Speaker. And Mr Chair, and the example I'm now going to give is around Clause 105 and the changes there, and I'm sure many people are going to talk about this. And this is, among other things, the proposing of what was initially called a national planning template. Now, here's how you know just how incoherent this piece of legislation has become, because that has now been renamed as something called a national planning standard, or, I hate to say it, an NPS. Now, we've already got them in the bill, in the Act. We've got things called national policy statements as opposed to national planning standards and national environment standards. So we've now created, or the Minister has created, some kind of hybrid thing called a national planning template or national planning standard. It's interesting to note in the departmental report, Mr Chair, that on this, there were a total, on this clause, there were a total of 230 submissions, 3 were neutral, 18 were in support, and 209 were against.
So pretty balanced.
Yeah, so clearly there were some concerns, and the overwhelming number of submitters, the departmental report tells us, were concerned that the Minister was creating far-reaching powers to determine land use, that the Minister was doing things that were contrary to constitutional law and the rule of law principles, not providing for an adequate public participatory process, creating additional costs and complexity for local authorities, does not provide for cohesion in the resource management system, and could be used to regulate GMOs, which obviously is a matter dealt with by one of the SOPs. Submitters contended that the decision-making criteria here in terms of what the role the Minister had used phrase like not reasonably required, undesirable, in the Minister's opinion, necessary, etc. All of that, Mr Chair, is the creation of uncertainty and complexity within this law. And rather than finding under this process the way in which we could use the tools that are already in the Act, national policy statements, national environment standards, as a way of giving guidance to local authorities to make the decisions, the very thing that the Act was set up on is totally compromised here by the Minister. The Minister has decided it's not easy to create national policy statements or national environment standards, so he's going to override them. That's essentially what he's done. After 8 or 9 years, he's been so ineffective at creating national policy statements. In this particular example, which I'm sure my colleague Phil Twyford will talk about around urban form and urban design, he's been so hopeless at doing it that he decides the only way through is to override it. That is wrong, Mr Chair. That's why we're opposing this legislation, because it is not the way to do this. It undermines the fundamental principles of this Act that are about decision-making occurring where it is best, where the people who know it best are, and that there is a clear and coherent process. The Minister had an opportunity here. He could have developed a piece of legislation that was widely supported. He's failed because he has created major powers for himself.
I'm calling Dennis O'Rourke.